Hello, eighth graders. We're going to continue with the preparing for the Civil War. Yesterday, we talked about the Unions and Confederates and the soldiers and what territories they were occupying. So, right now, we're going to go into what Lincoln meant when he declared martial law. So, after a pro Confederate attack on Union troops, President Lincoln declared martial law in Maryland. So, remember that at this point, Washington, D.C. was looking like it had the potential of being surrounded by all Confederate areas. And that was a negative thing because obviously DC was considered more of a Union area because of Abraham Lincoln, who was in support of the Union and the unification of the United States of America. So, martial law, let me explain this real quick for those of you that do not know. Martial law is a temporary control by the military. So, at this point, our society, our economy, our citizens are in control or controlled by a representative government. So that means that the people that make most of the decisions were elected in those positions by the citizens of the United States. Martial law is when the only person that controls the decisions that are made in the United States is the American military. So this is pretty negative and is usually used in cases of emergency, cases of disaster. For example, if there was a natural disaster and there was a huge need for military to move people from one area or another, for example, like a huge hurricane, that would be an example of when martial law may be executed. There has been talk of whether or not martial law will need to be used if the coronavirus worsens. There's some really interesting articles on that right now. So, pretty much, it is a last resort in which there is no way to peacefully send enforcements or control a citizen, and they just immediately use the military and the military like resources that they have, the Navy, the Air Force, National Guard, things like that. So it is definitely not a positive thing when martial law is declared. That means that something has gone terribly wrong and they need to use force in order to um, carry out a mission or a task. So definitely, if President Lincoln declared martial law, that means that Maryland was completely torn, tensions were high, and there was something that they needed to take by force or return by force. So martial law is a rule by the army instead of by elected officials. Many people who sided with Confederacy were put in prison due to this martial law because obviously martial law is something that is supported by the president, who is in control of the American military and army. So people that were on the side of the Confederacy were put in prison, probably for rioting, things of that nature, violence. The two sides, the Southern advantage, we're going to talk about Southern advantage, disadvantage, and then obviously Northern advantages and disadvantages. One Southern advantage was that it fight a defensive war. So hunting was an important part of the Southern life. They learned early to ride horses and use guns and have that those strategies and characteristics that make a very flexible and resilient soldier. And also, wealthy children went to military schools in the South. So they had more strategies, more intelligence, things that made them more of an advantage as a soldier than, for example, a volunteer that maybe had no prior experience with guns, riding, or any of those kind of military strategies. So a disadvantage of the South is that they had few factories or manufacturing like entities to make guns, cannons, railroad tracks, and other supplies. Remember that railroad tracks was the primary source of moving resources, weapons, food, equipment for soldiers. So having that not be one of their strengths was obviously a very big disadvantage. Southerners brought manufactured goods from the North and Europe. Obviously, that was cut off. South had few railroads, so like we talked about transporting resources and goods, and only 9 million people lived in the South, and one-third of the population were slaves. So the North had 22 million people. Now, I think that's pretty interesting because I think when at this point in time, when I think of the South, I think of larger states. So the fact that the North had over twice as much people living there is significant, and the fact that obviously slaves were not specifically used to fight in these wars, or were not the first choice to fight in these wars, meant that there was even less people that were eligible to become soldiers to fight on the Confederacy's behalf. So, a northern advantage was obviously the large population of 22 million people, and they were willing to volunteer for the army. They were passionate. They worked in factories, so they had opportunities for resources and goods, and they also grew a lot of food. So, that was also another resource. The North had 70% of the nation's railroads, so they were able to transport supplies, equipment, weapons very quickly and strategically and in a more organized manner. For example, sending something on a railroad and going down the track is much more organized and efficient than, say, having to carry enough food for thousands of soldiers on the back of a horse or on some kind of wheeled trailer. A strong navy, which Lincoln used to blockade the southern ports, was also significant because it halted the transportation of the South, which led to one more advantage for the North. Some of the disadvantages of northern states in the Union were to bring the South back into the United States. Northern soldiers had to conquer a huge area. So, obviously, the states that were considered in this section of the North were larger when you look at territory and acres. So, they had a lot more to conquer, a lot more ground to cover. Instead of defending their own homes, they were invading land that was not familiar to them. And I want you to keep in mind, kind of put yourself in the position of the people that were fighting. Once you were born in a certain area around this time, you very rarely left your own area. Now people move state to state, they move city to city, sometimes traveling countries. That's not super uncommon now, but at this point in time, you probably did not pass a certain mileage outside of the area that you were born in. People stayed pretty much in their place, or they went from one place to another and they settled. Traveling was incredibly inconvenient. You couldn't easily load up a truck and move all of your furniture, your home, your family. Traveling at this point was incredibly inconvenient. So having to defend their mission so far away from where they were born. I mean, temperatures were different, climate was different, um, the entire area looked different. It was definitely unfamiliar. It was a pretty strong disadvantage, more so than you would realize. Um, and this also led their homes, their family, their wives, and their children up with no defense. So that was obviously a very big weakness, having to worry about that. And think about the ways of communicating at this point were by mail. So obviously, having that lack of communication would lead people to worry about their own family back home. So, wartime leaders, this is something that we looked at last week. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. Remember that the Southern states try to create their own independent government separate from DC, separate from the White House, separate from Abraham Lincoln. So, the person that they put in charge that they believed had their best interest at heart was Jefferson Davis. Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States. Obviously, he was the one that was appointed in the governmental structure in which had been used up until this point when it comes to creating a unified government, a central government in DC. So, if you look at the quote unquote right way somebody was elected, that would have been recognized as President Abraham Lincoln. And Robert E. Lee, he faced a difficult decision when Virginia, his home state, seceded or separated from the Union. President Lincoln asked Lee to command the Union Army. So obviously, this was a man who lived in a state that was opposing his personal beliefs, but he was asked by the president or the elected president of the United States to command the Army of the North or the Union Army. With all my devotion to the Union, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, and my home. So, this again ties back to the idea that people were fighting one another, people that were relatives at one point, people that might have been neighbors at one point. This was a war that was fought at home against home. So usually when we talk about wars, we think about these different wars that we have with other countries, with maybe quote unquote foreigners, things that are happening outside of our own home. But these were wars that were fought in people's backyards. These are wars that were fought literally down the way from where they were raised. So having somebody that was maybe against slavery but lived in a southern territory state, that was a very big challenge. You had to go against your everything that you had known. So this was a pretty big challenge, especially for Robert E. Lee. But Lee became the commander of the Confederate Army because he was torn against going with what he believed versus what he was raised by and what his family and his children and everything that he had known. So this was a pretty big controversy back during this time of the Civil War. This right here is where we're going to end. We are going to continue looking at the Civil War a little bit longer, but obviously the year has come to an end. So you guys will continue looking at American history maybe briefly in ninth grade, but I think most of your curriculum is going to look at world history as a whole. So um, with that being said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But this is the last PowerPoint we will have this year. So congrats, guys. You did it. And thank you for listening.